All right, how's this? Smashing, excellent. Okay, so JavaScript on the desktop. So when I started programming way back in the day, I started with this little language called C++. Actually wasn't that little of a language, but that's what I started with, and that's what I did well with for many years. Eventually I landed on C#, and then through that, eventually on JavaScript, which is of course why we're all here today. And I think what's interesting is along the trajectory of my career, you know, it became clearer and clearer that JavaScript is, as Douglas Crockford says, our new overlord. That it works everywhere. It works on our servers. It works on our mobile devices with things like PhoneGap. But it never really got back around to those original apps I was writing, those desktop apps in C++ and C#. And so 2 years ago, I started at a company, barnesandnoble.com in the US, where we actually were writing desktop apps in HTML5 and JavaScript. And we'll talk more about that in particular later. But I thought this was just a pretty cool kind of full circle, how JavaScript really has taken over every aspect of software development. And we don't need any of those outdated languages anymore. And I think there's a session going on concurrently about how we don't even need, you know, any of those apps or languages for Windows 8. It's all just JavaScript these days. So a little bit about me. You can find me on GitHub and NPM, and you can find the presentations I've done on SlideShare. The things I've done recently that I'm rather proud of, I have this website, ES6 is nigh, based on a presentation I did at Empire.js in New York City about the future of JavaScript, the ECMAScript 6 standard. I think you might enjoy checking that out if you find that kind of stuff fun. I get a reputation as the promises guy because I'm very interested in promises and async programming pattern, and recently I've collaborated on a open standard for the next generation of promises based on kind of the de facto implementations that we've seen over the last few years called Promises A+. And finally, kind of on a related topic to this one, at Cascadia.js last weekend in Seattle, Washington, I gave a talk on kind of the real world experience of building apps in Windows 8 with HTML5 and JavaScript. And I think that's a fun talk. You can find it on YouTube. Because I don't think many people expected me to be as honest, perhaps, as I was about the development experience there. So people kind of expected to go to Seattle and hear a typical Microsoft evangelist talk about, you know, it's awesome. Building desktop apps in HTML5 and JavaScript for Windows 8 is amazing. And I kind of just didn't go that route at all. So as I said, I work at barnesandnoble.com, and I work in the digital education division on a product called Nook Study, which is an e-textbook reader for Mac and PC. It runs on your desktop, and it's mainly for students to help them read their textbooks, study, share notes, take notes, so on and so forth. And this is an interesting product in a lot of ways because, you know, as I say, you know, we wrote it in HTML5 and JavaScript. All the UI and all the interaction is through JavaScript, but there's also a lot of C++ components that we integrate with through the plugin API for things like DRM or synchronizing to the Barnes & Noble cloud. But so that's kind of where I'm coming from, experience-wise. But the real question I want to start this with is why desktop apps? Well, I can think of two really good reasons, namely the keyboard and the mouse, right? You know, kids these days with their newfangled tablets and Windows 8 slates and phones and everything, you can't do exciting things on that, like, to some degree. You can't create content. You can't write the next great American novel. You need a real user interface through a keyboard and a mouse, in my very strong opinion. But of course, this doesn't answer why desktop apps. This just says you should use a computer. So why not just a web app? Like Gmail's getting along pretty fine as a web app. Well, here's some reasons why you might want to write a desktop app. You know, we have the wonderful cross-origin restrictions, and the fact that every time you want to do anything even slightly fancy or interesting, you get these nice pop-ups that the user is now in full control of your destiny. You know, can you use the camera? Can you share your location? Can you send desktop notifications? You just have to ask. And pretty soon, you know, you want a full-featured app, and you got 4 or 5 of these things piling up, and yay, now you can use your app. If you write a desktop app, you know, you get direct access to these things with no worries, even if you write in HTML5 and JavaScript. And the final set of reasons, I think, is ones we're all familiar with, which is the wonders of cross-browser compatibility. So we've got WebKit prefixes all over the place. We've got this can I use chart on get user media, which is only supported in Chrome, but sometimes in Opera, but I don't know. And even things like the experimental Chrome features that we'd all love to use, but we can't because they're locked behind Chrome flags. So things like the next version of JavaScript, they prototype some things in there. We might like to use that writing our apps. It'd make us a lot more productive. Or even things that are faster like Speedy 3 or CSS shaders for very cool effects. If you write a desktop app instead of a web app, you're in complete control of your environment. You can say, my version of Chrome has these things. My environment enables all these things, and I don't have to worry about prefixes. I don't have to worry about cross-browser compatibility. And the final thing is that desktop apps used to get a bad rap because there was no discoverability or updatability. Well, this is kind of changed. All these problems are starting to go away. We have an app store for desktop apps on the Mac, and actually even on Windows 8, we have an app store. Besides the Metro apps that you hear a lot about, you can put desktop apps in the app store like Photoshop or whatever you create, and it'll just launch out to your website and you go download it. So the discoverability problem is being solved, and the updating problem is also being solved. Desktop apps are in much better shape compared to web apps these days. So if you want to take advantage of all these things, you feel free to do so. So in the wild, kind of what do I mean by a desktop app written in HTML5? Well, I think the best thing to do is show you. So this is the app I work on. It's called Nook Study. And let's actually just switch over to that for a little bit so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So this is Nook Study, right? So it's an e-textbook reader. You can manage your library, see all the different things in it, and you can shop on the internet, pops up dialogues, and it's interesting kind of like to note as we go through this that you can see these aren't exactly native UI controls. I can't drag this outside the window, for example. So you can see it's HTML5 and JavaScript. It's not exactly native, but it does give us a lot of power and flexibility, because we can reuse code from the web, and we can reuse the engineering resources from our web team, and we can use these technologies that are honestly a lot more fun than something like C#. And another interesting point about Nook Study I want to point out is if you go in to read a book, we launch into this reader interface. And what's interesting is everything on this screen is actually drawn by C++ in a C++ component written by Adobe called their Reader Mobile SDK, which renders PDFs and EPUBs, and in particular takes care of all the DRM around that. So that's stuff that you don't actually want to write in JavaScript if you don't have to, because there's an established way of rendering PDFs. I mean, there's some pretty great JavaScript PDF renderers out there, but it's not I don't want to maintain that. So we can just outsource this to a plugin and bundle that with our app instead of saying, oh, well, when you go to the web reader for barnesandnoble.com, we have to have you download this browser add-on or plugin. And no, if you write a desktop app, you can get direct access to C++ plugins and things like that. So again, we handle all the stuff on top of that, like this dialogue or whatever, but underneath it, we interface directly with C++. The other example in the wild that I think is really cool is because it's open source, is Adobe's Brackets IDE, which is a way of writing HTML5 and JavaScript and CSS and all that, web technologies, and they actually wrote it in HTML5 and JavaScript. And so I mean, this is just an example of it. You can go check out all these different things. And what I think is cool is they've exposed, because this is open source, they're like not worried about you poking around in their stuff. You can just click Show Developer Tools, and it launches a Chrome remote debugger. And wow, actually, we can just step through the body of that thing, and we can do things like, inspect element, for example. If we go and inspect this guy, it goes and finds it in the DOM. So as you can see, I mean, this is what I mean when I say writing an app in HTML5 and JavaScript, is actually all the UI and possibly all the business logic is written in JavaScript and HTML, and we get to use all those technologies that we love and play with every day, but for something like an IDE or a textbook reader that you wouldn't normally see on the web. All right, so back to this guy. Right, so got those two examples in the wild, and that's unfortunate. brackets. All right, so how, right? How do we end up writing desktop apps in HTML5 and JavaScript? Well, the magic that underlies it all is Chromium. This is the logo for Chromium, the open source foundation underlying Google Chrome. And in particular, what happened is some time ago, I think about a year ago, the developers of Chrome got together and they said, wow, our code is a mess. We need to separate our concerns and say, what do we use to render pages and to GPU accelerate pages and execute JavaScript? And what do we use to put around the browser and like keep the user's history and cookies and all that? Right? So they separated it out from the content from the Chrome. And the Chrome Content API is how all this actually ends up working. And so this actually underlies Chrome's whole multi-process architecture, where there's a Chrome that talks to the content over inter-process communication, and there's a content for each tab that shows up. And you get this wonderful diagram pulled straight from the docs about how you just got the Chrome on top, and that's like what you think of as your browser, but all the hard work goes underneath there. Whether it be the content API or the networking stack or the WebKit glue or whatever. And of course, so what we want to do is we want to pull out all that into something we can use for our particular apps. We don't want Chrome's tabs and its bookmarks and all that, but we do want to render HTML5 and JavaScript and write apps. And you can do this yourself. It's not fun and it's not pretty, but you can. Nook Study did this for the release that's currently out, and it was made some work for our C++ programmers, and the brackets ID actually did this as well for their first few iterations. But that's a lot of work, and it would be really nice if somebody would do that for us. So thankfully, the magic of open source comes to our rescue, and somebody has done this for us. There's this project called the Chromium Embedded Framework, which really underlies a lot of these efforts. So it's somebody to say, let's take Chrome and let's take those big chunks and let's pull them out into a separate thing that you can embed your own application into. And it works on all the operating systems. You can do nice things like create objects in C++ to access the underlying operating system capabilities and expose them to JavaScript through a nice API. You can integrate plugins like the ones I was talking about for textbook reading or anything else. You can do cool things like intercepting HTTP requests, including custom schemes. So if somebody launches your app, or if somebody navigates to like bnbook:// you can get notified and your app will launch in response to that. So this is, for example, how I believe if you go to a Spotify and you click on their link, they'll intercept that, launch a Spotify browser or Spotify player. And of course, you can completely customize the browser settings and flags and security restrictions and all that, like the stuff we saw at the beginning. So you don't have to be subject to cross-origin requests restrictions. You can turn on ECMAScript 6 features. You can do all this cool stuff. And of course, it's C++, so do whatever you want. Lots of power there. The code looks like this. It's not so bad for C++, I suppose. But of course, I don't like C++. I'm a JavaScript programmer now. Everything's in JavaScript, right? It's kind of a familiar problem, actually, if you think about it. We want to use JavaScript to do something complicated, and it usually requires a lot of C++. We want to do it cross-platform, and we somehow want to integrate with the V8 JavaScript engine underlying this all. I wonder if there's another kind of large project that does those things. Oh wait, there is. Node.js to the rescue. So it turns out people have actually kind of thought about this and said, wow, if we just put Node and Chromium together, then people would never have to write C++, but they'd have access to all the cool cross-platform APIs that let you dig deep into the system. So there's two projects that do this, and I want to spend the rest of the talk kind of talking about and demoing them, going into them in detail. They're called AppJS and Node Webkit. And they take some different approaches, which I think it's really interesting to contrast and kind of decide what would be better for your application. I really can't decide between them, which I like more. Like every time I go to a presentation by the Node Webkit guys, like I did in Shanghai a few months ago, I'm like, wow, this is amazing. But then I look at the AppJS samples and I'm like, whoa, they're actually doing some neat stuff. So decide for yourself, but be aware of the options. And they're of course both on GitHub, open source, and rather active actually. They're contributed to, we've got some 5 days ago or 10 days ago and I think 1 day ago over there. So AppJS is a Node.js module. You do npm install Node.js, and then you can require it and do things like serve files from a directory. And then you can say, set up the routes so that when you post data inside your browser, we respond like a Node.js server would. You can create this whole Node.js server entirely on your file system. And then, of course, the magic happens. It's where you create a window. You just say, OK, we'll create a window, navigate to the root URL, and you can pass all these parameters, like width and height, or you can turn on or off full screen. You can turn on or off the border and the title bars. You can get these kind of kiosk mode, no Chrome browser windows if you want to do, for example, a game. And of course, you want to disable security, so you can do all the fun things that browsers won't let you do. And what's interesting about AppJS is because it's this kind of node-first system, there's a lot of flexibility for how you integrate. So, for example, you get this window object when you create a window, and you can do things like, well, first you want to show it, but then you could just attach the require and process and module variables directly to your window. So what this means is that when you're inside your HTML page that's executing inside this window, you now have access to the entire Node.js ecosystem just by using these globals you've assigned. So I think that's pretty neat, and they've done some magic to make that happen. But of course, you can do more complicated things than this, right? Like you could, for example, create a require that looks up on the file system the files if it can't find it in npm or whatever. They have some samples for how you can create a require that works for both your own modules that you write for browser code and that works for npm packages. And so not only can you control Node from your app by just injecting those kind of control structures, you can also control your app from Node, of course. You can listen for events like close or resize, full screen, so on. And you can manipulate the window frame. You can open the dev tools or go to full screen. You can even do communication in a completely custom way because you have a window object. It's a complete DOM. You can do whatever you want. You can just dispatch an event from Node, perhaps in response to an HTTP push from some server, and just dispatch it to the window, and there you go. Listen to it from within your app code. They also have some niceties, right? So if you want to create a menu bar, you can just do so. You do so on your Node side and set it. Right, so this is nice because on Mac especially, but also on Windows, we have these big menu bars that are very native to the system. And I don't know if you saw when I was doing brackets, but they have these fake menu bars, which are looking kind of unfortunate. Like they're custom, they don't fit into the system. There's actually a little tiny menu bar above it that does fit into the system, which is really, really yucky. But with these kind of tools, they've just wrapped up all the C++ that goes into creating a menu for you, put it in JavaScript, because we like coding JavaScript. JavaScript is fun. And there's more cool stuff, right? You can look this all up. You can get tray icons and tray menus for bugging the user when you're saying, like, oh, I'm updating your media library. Good times. You can, as I said, add a require that works for both sides. You can do things like, because you have this raw access to both sides, you can redirect Node standard out and standard error to the Chromium dev console. Right? So if you get an error on your HTTP side, you can just say, oh, that's in my F12 developer tools. This is pretty much useful just for debugging Node. And you can do anything. You can use Express to handle your routes and render your views if you want to write all your stuff in Jade instead of HTML, and render your Sass, whatever. You can use any third-party Node package to do anything. If you need access to like the low-level DNS resolver interfaces, you can use it from within your browser, or rather from within your app, all from client-side or traditionally client-side JavaScript. So let's look at Node Webkit. Well, here's the example for Node Webkit. It's actually a lot less manual, right? Node Webkit is meant to be kind of simple and easy to get started with. You just create an index.html, and you can start using Node stuff right away. So for example, here I'm writing out the process.version, which is a Node property. Boom, there you go. And actually, the way they do this is kind of impressive. I was very, very taken aback by the depths they'd gone to integrate these two technologies. So they didn't build on CEF like AppJS did on Chromium embedded framework. They did the work all by themselves. It's funded by Intel, so there's a little bit of manpower behind there. But they actually merged Node and Chromium's JavaScript event loops by implementing Chromium's in terms of Node's libuv, their underlying C++ architecture. So for example, what's an implication of this? Well, if you pop up a modal dialog, a blocking alert, that will actually pause the entire Node event loop. I mean, I guess that's not so desirable, but it's a good illustration of how integrated these things are and how you're really working in the same process space. Similarly, like Node objects and DOM objects reside on the same V8 heap. There's no inter-process communication, no serialization, no threading issues. You don't have to pass stuff over boundaries. It's super fast, and it's super integrated. So you get direct access to everything. And this is a nice touch, I think, where if you have multiple windows in your app, right? So if you're doing like a document editor, for example, you have one for each document you're editing. They each have their own window variable, as you'd expect, but they can communicate with each other through the global object, the node global object, which is cool. So you don't have to do any of those post-message type stuff that we saw in our previous iframe talk to talk between windows. You can just be like, oh, well, I'm going to use the message passing system just through a variable, or events, or whatever. As long as you put it on the global variable, you're good. And if you want to put in plugins, like all these have solutions for that, but Node Webkit makes it super easy. You just drop them in a plugins directory, and it auto-detects it. And this is also a really cool trick. I mean, this just kind of shows how much thought they put into this. If you create a Node Webkit package, which is just a zip file, and then you cat the NW executable with the zip file, you now have an executable for your app. So, I mean, if you think about that, what did they do? They like implemented code in the executable to go look for the end of the executable and see if there's anything else, and then unzip it. I think that's really neat. All right, so kind of some more technical details and samples. They declare things, as I said, they make it easy. It's just a package JSON. So it's not kind of a JavaScript syntax to create new windows. So you say, here's the name for my package. Here's the main file. And you can create a node main to start things up before the normal browser event loop goes. And you can set all these properties for your window, icon, and so on. It has good platform integration with some nice APIs. Like you can, but again, this time we're working inside the browser, inside our app, not from a node side that talks over inter-process communication to the browser. So you get the window object has some augmented things like show dev tools or request attention true, which will make it bounce up and down on your dock. So don't ever do that. And you can do things like menus. And I think this is cool because they've actually made context menus really easily. So I don't know if you remember, but when I was demoing Nook Study, we had those custom context menus, which the designers tell us are super on brand and very important. But I would have preferred something that conforms to the system. And with Node Webkit, they make it really easy to do that. You just pop up that menu object you created at wherever the event was. Some more examples of that. They have a clipboard object to make it really nice so you can get and set things from the clipboard, full access. And they chose an interesting strategy for getting your file picker dialogues. So they've said that we already kind of have this in HTML, but not like fully. So they added some attributes, right? If you want to pick a single file or multiple files, we've got that in HTML. But if you want to pick a directory, or if you want to do the save as dialog instead of the open dialog, they add some custom attributes. And then they've just made it so that there's no more security restrictions on programmatically clicking those inputs. So if you want to open one of those dialogs, just create a virtual input and click it programmatically, and it works. So I thought that was kind of neat as a trick. So we got 5 minutes left, and I think that's perfect because I want to show you creating an app. Because we've talked about like how cool it is to create textbook readers and IDEs and all that. But I think the most important and most interesting thing here that we can do is create games, clearly. So the way you do this, so if we were to do this with Node Webkit, right? So we have this NW.exe, and we have this Pac-Man game that I downloaded from GitHub. And so all I need to do, well, I need to add a package JSON to tell it what's going on. So let's do that. It's just got a name, a main, and some window properties, right? And then I just need to zip it up, send to zip, Pac-Man, yeah, capitalize, it's cool. And then I can open that with Node Webkit. And so, as I said, if you concatenate these files together, you get one executable. But just while you're testing and as an intermediate step, you drag things between windows and it doesn't work because it creates a shortcut. Cool. There we go. We have a desktop app, HTML5 Pac-Man. And I don't think you can hear it, but it's definitely playing some awesome music. So, ta-da!